The Diary of Dr. X, Episode 4. The Triumph of Centralized Planning. When I was still a doctoral candidate at the University of Manitoba a few years back, I taught a course called Ecology, Technology, and Society. It was staffed by the anthropology department, people like me, but was offered in the engineering department. It was one of a couple of courses that department, in its wisdom, required their students to take in order to get their degree, which was intended to inform them of contemporary issues in the world. You know, like its imminent demise if we don't clean up our act. I taught the course 5 times over a 3-year span, or so my CV informs me. Engineering students, as you can imagine, were a difficult bunch to convince of many of the principles of ecology, and especially the political and economic implications. They were generally white middle-class kids from the south end of Winnipeg, which is the affluent part. They grew up affluent, obviously, and their folks were, well, professionals mainly, successfully feeding off of the system, and they expected the same as their birthright. So how to explain to this audience that our society's tendency towards greater and greater centralization, or globalization as it's now glossed in the literature, of the production and distribution system is not necessarily a good thing. After all, green economics has always emphasized the greater ecological efficiency of decentralized production and distribution systems, as I mentioned in episode 2. You know, as E.F. Schumacher, the acknowledged father of green economics, so famously stated, small is beautiful. And he was referring to the size of business enterprises. I struggled with how to present these concepts for a while in the face of their skepticism, dutifully teaching them my mentor's 4 key guides to the development of what he called an intermediate or ecologically appropriate technology. First, that it should be a decentralized production and distribution system based on relatively small, locally owned businesses. Second, that the means of production should not be capital intensive, but affordable to everyone. Third, that the technology should be relatively simple rather than requiring vast amounts of specialized knowledge to operate, which also makes it more accessible to everyone. And finally, and most importantly, that, and I quote, production should be mainly from local materials and mainly for local use. This again relates to the ecological efficiencies gained from the decentralization of the production system, because you aren't shipping resources thousands of miles, and you aren't shipping final products thousands of miles to market. It saves tons of energy and materials. Not surprisingly, these 4 suggestions for the development of an ecologically appropriate technology are the precise opposite of the corporate system's current tendencies towards developing productive technologies that increase the centralization of organization, the complexity of technology, capital cost, so no one can afford to compete with them, and ecological destructiveness. They are also the complete opposite of the current trends towards the globalization of production and distribution systems, and the centralization of ownership of the means of production in fewer and fewer hands. As I say, I dutifully taught the core of green economics to these budding engineers a couple of times. I could see it was largely falling on deaf ears, though. The corporate media and their upbringing had pretty much brainwashed them into the status quo, that centralization was a natural part of economic growth, and that both were a good thing because they were good for the bottom line. So what was I to do to reach these people, this audience? Around the 3rd time I taught the class, as I remember, I had a little epiphany as I was going over my notes for this lecture. The next day, I went into class armed with a new argument I had never thought of before, and I've been teaching it this way ever since. And now I'm going to share it with you. I grew up in the Cold War era, I began. You remember, when we were all worried about our imminent demise due to nuclear annihilation. This got their attention. People nodded and recalled their parents' stories, since it was before their time. Well, during that time, it was common in the corporate media to contrast the Soviet economic and political system with our own by pointing out that while we had free markets, the Soviets had central planning. Again, a nod from the class. They were getting it. So I took the next logical step. So why is it, several years after the collapse of the Soviet system and the end of the threat of global communism, which was what we were all afraid of, that we now speak about globalization of the economic system as a good thing? The class was silent. Don't you think that centralized planning would be of use to increasingly global corporate institutions? I could see light bulbs lighting up over people's heads all over the room. The main difference, I continued, are that transnational corporations are privately owned rather than owned by the state, and that they are globally organized rather than confined within the borders of the Soviet Union. And that is precisely what we feared the Soviet system of central planning would become, a global system. So globalization actually represents the triumph of centralized planning, such as the Soviet system used, but in the global capitalist system. Ironic, isn't it? While they, the Soviets, had communist government central planning, we now increasingly have a system based on commercial corporate central planning, or CCCP for short. More light bulbs. It was working. So I paraphrased Wendell Berry, radical ecologist, essayist, and organic farmer, another hero of mine. Problem is, I said, that bigness is totalitarian because it establishes an absolute trend towards the one who will be biggest of all. You could have heard a pin drop in that classroom. Capitalism is incredibly malleable, don't you agree? It didn't defeat communism. It absorbed its central principles, which is why I refer to it as CCCP, which you may recall was how USSR was spelled in the Russian alphabet. Cheers.